Welcome back to Radio Entrepreneurs. I'm Jonathan Freedman, joined by the one and only, I should say, not our one and only, but the one and only, Phil Sharkey of the Higher Authority. Welcome back, as always, to Radio Entrepreneurs. You always have some great stuff to bring us.
Thank you, Jonathan. Much appreciated. It's always a pleasure speaking with you and going over some of what I see in the background screening world. And I think I have a good topic for you today. I think it's very interesting, a point that I see happen in my world quite often.
So tell us about what it is. I know in your background screening and looking at candidates, you come across all types, but you also work with a lot of organizations. So tell us, today's topic you want to talk about is the world of recruiting versus background screening.
I do, Jonathan, because it comes up a lot with us. And to be honest with you, there was a time, I've been at it so long, where recruiters really didn't mesh well with us. They would say, stand back, we do our work. We don't need you. We vet the people ourselves. We're sort of stepping on each other's toes. We don't need your service. In the last 5, 6, 7 years, we have quite a few, maybe a dozen or so recruiting companies as clients. And what we found is that, and in fact, I know Radio Entrepreneurs has a stable of great recruiters, and they know their field, they know their lane, and like, Mark Z, they're experts in their field. But when it comes to our clients, and I just had a case I want to go over with you today in the manufacturing field, where the recruiting company claimed they were vetted and everything was fine. The client, knowing us, still sent them to us to do a background check. And I'll point out to you how fine turned out to be a near disaster for them. So they're not the same. Again, recruiters are great. I think the first big difference, Jonathan, is that background screening, my company, we have no horse in the race. So again, no disrespect to the recruiters, but you build a rapport. If I'm placing Jonathan, I get to know you, I see your history. It's advantageous for me to place you. That's how I make my living. For example, when I brought my daughter to get braces, and the orthodontist said, oh yeah, she needs braces. He looked at her for 1.2 seconds. I mean, that's his field. Everybody needs braces. So recruiters, their job is to place someone to a job. They're always looking in that regard. They want to look at
makes perfect sense. And I think as we've evolved, and the world is so much more specialized today, right? Whether it's medicine and specialties and subspecialties or recruiting. And I think, to your point, there's a specialization that you guys focus in for a reason. Let's get into it after you talk a little bit about the example and the case. But one of the questions I have is, clearly, when you have specialization, you've got certain tools. When I jump under my sink to change a drain and use, a wrench, well, if I'm not using a plumber's wrench, shame on me. So I suspect that some of the things are the same things that you guys have access to. But let's talk a little bit about the case that you want to bring us today.
It's a great point, Jonathan. And again, the big issue is, we have no horse in the race. We work directly for my client. So I'm going over the person very closely, and I'm looking at the flaws and anything I can point out. Again, I'm not to be adversarial, but if things are wrong, I'm going to point them out. So in this case, it was a manufacturing position, a very important position. I was going to run the whole manufacturing department for this client, had to have huge trust with them. They only had one person in that role before. So when we started the background check, again, the recruiting company, the headhunter said everything was vetted. The person was perfectly ready to start. They had an interview, built a rapport. As soon as we started the background check, the very first thing off the jump was educational verification. Again, it's a machine shop, it's production. How important that is that? Well, the important part is they claimed a degree from the school up in New Hampshire. Upon immediately contacting the school, all we found out was that he enrolled to go to the school, never stepped onto campus one day. Not 1 minute on the campus, no 4-year degree. Again, the length of the lies to me is what's impressive. Then here's where it really gets poor. Employment was listed as present. He was in the process of giving notice from a company in Florida. One call down to the company. We spoke to the human resources manager. Company said he left last July per a mutual agreement. So now watch the lies line up. He said he was leaving because the company was moving to Georgia. We asked the human resources director, she's news to me. She goes, we're not going anywhere. I better start packing, I guess. Not moving to Georgia. The position claimed, which was operations manager, was not as production supervisor. And the reason for leaving back in July, when they claimed to be presently employed, was a mutual agreement between the company and himself. Now, I call these almost, we've had talks in the past like George Santos. I call these like Santos type of lies, because they're so easy for me to find out. And they put such lack of trust in the individual. And when you go back to that person, how can you ever trust them, Jonathan, to run the department, be there at night? My client travels a lot. He goes to China. He goes on trips to the West Coast. The person would be basically in charge of the business, and there's
Leaving
no
essentially
integrity.
the kids in the candy store without any supervision. You
Absolutely.
know, we've talked about this a lot in your segments, you know, I liken your role to whether it's opening the Pandora's box or peeling back the layers of the onion. And what's fascinating in this case that you talk about is, you know, all you had to do was see the tip of the iceberg, the first you know, I'll call it, I don't know, lie, but certainly an untruth.
Right.
And you know, you peel back, and that's your role, is to really figure out, is there a pattern here?
Absolutely.
As we've talked about, sometimes, you know, there's a inconsistency, if you will, and the inconsistency can be explained. And that's, you know, I guess if you had gone that far and the first thing was an inconsistency and there was some justification and it made sense, and then you dig to the second thing and there's no more inconsistencies, great.
Right.
But in your case here, you probably saved the client from a lot of
Huge
potential
risk.
problems,
And
right?
Jonathan,
And
you're so right. Where I tell my clients, it's not all about me coming off and saying, "Aha, another liar! I got one." You know, put a X on my board. The fact is, like you said, the background check is information, and if you still like that person, you can go back to them and say, "Jonathan, can you explain these inconsistencies like you mentioned? You said you were leaving. Now you left there last July. What happened? Can you fill me in? What's going on here to your thinking? This was so egregious that it was just so flat out flabbergasting type of lie. Also, we put down a supervisor. We're very good at our job, but I'm not a miracle man. It's very common sense. We asked the company about the supervisor. Supervisor didn't work there. They didn't know who that person was. So again, you see how, as you said, the onion, the lies are compounding like a George Santos, where you can't trust him at all. Said he was buying a house up here, moving back from Florida. My client said, "Is that even truthful? Who knows what is truthful about this person?"
yeah,
So it was
so
so much.
So certainly really fascinating. You know, it seems to me that you know, your role and in terms of what you guys do is to just to do that, to follow the trail and to be able to dig. You know, contrasting that, and not to say that recruiters don't do it, but again, you know, they have a horse in the race. There's I don't want to say there's a conflict, but certainly, you know, they're not likely in a lot of cases getting paid, or at least not getting the pot of gold until they place a candidate, and so they have an incentive to place a candidate. And you know, I think by and large the industry is ethical and they want to place good candidates and consistency. But
Absolutely.
do they, if they've got a mandate with 10 different clients, do they have the time to do the digging?
Right.
And
They
do
don't
they
have
have the, yeah.
the time, the energy, as you mentioned, and the inclination to really go through their people and shoot them all down. They're in the volume business. They do want to place a good candidate, and I know there's many out there. And again, so many use us now where they do their recruiting work and they just say, "Hold off, we're just going to send them over for the background check." They even step back. Now they're not the bad guy. If anything shows up, I'm the bad guy. And then they try to work it out. In this case, I think the disconnect, Jonathan, is that the recruiting company said the man was vetted. I think a lot of people think, they did a criminal check, as did we, and they were right. It was clear in Massachusetts. It was clear in Florida. So we're in agreement there. So that might be the real disconnect, where that what they considered was a background check. It's not. It's just one component of a background check. It's the criminal part of it. Very important. But as you see in this example, just one minor part regarding honesty and integrity.
Well, I would say that. I mean, it's fascinating. All a criminal background check will tell you that they haven't been caught or
Exactly.
they
That's
haven't been prosecuted for their crimes. So,
right,
you know, in
right. They
this
might be a real
particular
good criminal. They might just be
right.
really good at
In this
evading
particular
taxes.
case where you're leaving, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the proverbial kids to the, you know, in the candy store, the keys to the candy store. You know, what happens when inventory is walking out the back door? What happens when, you know, inconsistencies in inventory and things of that nature? So always good
Exactly.
stuff, Phil. I don't want to put you on the spot here, you know, in terms of giving up the secret sauce and the recipe, but you know, in your field, I would imagine you do have access to various, and we've talked about this, so I know that you do, various databases that recruiters certainly aren't paying for and don't have access to, and various other tools. So, you know, really important to enlist you and your firm to be able to dig in where perhaps a layperson, an HR person, or a recruiter, or anybody in the talent acquisition scope probably doesn't have access to.
Exactly, Jonathan. A lot of databases come in, as we've talked about before, address history. And again, most times when I do have criminals, it's not where they are, that's where they have been. And people go through great lengths then to try and hide former address history. And that's where our databases come in. In this example, it was just good old fashioned background screening. It was the calls. But once again, HR people, recruiters, this time it took about us 4 or 5 calls to get through to the company in today's world and to get a response. A lot of people don't have that time anymore. They can't be bothered doing a million jobs in HR. They have such a wide, expansive position. They don't have time to 4 or 5 phone calls and maybe miss that call back. That's all we do. So we kept at it. We got the response. Our client eventually spoke to the gentleman and said, I just need to talk to you about the background check. He picked up the phone and called right back. I'm sure he was well aware he had no criminal record. And as soon as my client said, what happened with the job? You said you were still there, and we were told you were left the job last July. And he had a click response. The phone was disconnected, never talked to me again. Called the recruiting company. They said, we'll get to the bottom of this. They got nowhere with him, never heard from him again. So I think, again, when I get to the Santos type of lie, I don't think he envisioned that it would get to this point where they actually would call my most recent employer, which is
Yeah, no,
one.
it's really fascinating, and I think it's probably a topic for another day and a whole other opportunity. But I think, and I've seen it personally in a lot of cases. Companies go through the vetting process, and they're so desperate to fill a role that they as long as the person has given them something to go on, they check out in terms of some of the pieces, they stop there.
Right.
And to your point, I'm guilty sitting in front of you. I've Googled people's names, and you come up with 65 John Smith, John Smiths. You come up with 650,000 of them, and how do you find the right one, et cetera, et cetera. So go to professionals like yourselves. Identify the candidates and let you do the so-called deep, dirty work behind the scenes to uncover what the possibilities are.
Jonathan, it's a great point. And just quickly, is that, like you said, you also have to err on the side of caution, and we do protect the applicant as well. Always have a signed release from them and their authorization. I'm never out to harm anyone. And as you said, just Google searching or doing the minimum. There's so many matches. You have to be darn well sure you have the right person. We always, when we do have records, confirmed by date of birth, address history, social if possible, and then we know that we're not harming or saying something wrong about someone that happens to be someone else with the same name. So it's very important.
As always, wonderful stuff. Phil Sharkey, the Higher Authority. If people want to get in touch with you, want to use your services, want to talk more about this, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
2 ways, Jonathan, toll free at 888-230-5901. Or you can also reach us on the web at hireauth.com. That's hireauth.com. And again, unlike some of these large impersonal competitors of ours, you get a response either immediately or very shortly thereafter. So we're here for everybody.
As always, great speaking with you, Phil. Phil Sharkey, President and owner of the Higher Authority. Wonderful having you on this segment, and we'll be right back with another guest on Radio Entrepreneurs.